The quick transaction feature of CenterPoint is a means of entering in multiple transactions all on the same screen and then posting them all at once. Only one transaction type at a time can be entered, such as payments, receipts, or vendor invoices. This option can be helpful in environments that are heavy data entry oriented, such as a service bureau, or can be used for entering in a group of transactions, such as the monthly EFTs that came off of your bank statement. To get to quick transactions, we're going to go to Processes, and then to the option for Quick Transactions. It's going to ask me some information that is going to be constant for all of the transactions that are part of this entire group. So it's going to ask me for a description of these transactions, and I'm going to say that these are my July EFT transactions. I'll say July 2019 because I could be doing this for quite some time. Okay, so those are my July 2019 EFT transactions, electronic funds transfer. It's going to ask me for a company. So I'm going to choose my company, Alpine Sports. If you had multiple companies, of course, you could select which company. You're going to then choose a transaction type. And remember, I said you can only use one transaction type at a time within one of these groupings. Then 3 kinds of transactions that you could enter in with a quick transaction screens are payments, receipts, and vendors invoices. I'm going to choose payments. And because I chose payments, it's asking me for a bank account. With either payments or receipts, it'll ask you for a bank account to post it against. And if you had chosen vendor invoices, it would be asking us for an AP account here. I'm also going to be asked which sequence I want to assign to these transactions. So all the transactions within here are going to have the same sequence number. The sequence also determines whether or not that transaction is going to automatically be marked to print it or not. So if I was entering in a bunch of checks that I wanted to print, I would usually my regular payment sequence, which likely is going to be set up to have it marked to print checks each time. Since I'm entering in electronic funds transfers, I'm going to use a sequence that I have set up, and that sequence is not set up as a default to print the transactions. So I'm going to go ahead and select that sequence and click OK. And it brings me to the screen where I do all of my data entry. Now the information at the top, the header at the top, becomes constant for each of the transactions. They're all going to be for the company Alpine Sports. They're all going to be payment type transactions posted against the bank account, cash and bank checking, and using the sequence of EFT. Okay, each line of the transaction becomes, or each line of the screen becomes a separate transaction. So each transaction has its own date. So let's say that the first transaction we want to enter in was on my bank account as a transaction that was posted on July 14th of 2019. Okay, it's going to bring up the next transaction number in my sequence. I do have the ability to override that right here. And then it's going to ask me for my vendor name. Now, this screen really works best with vendors that you have set up to either do a recurring transaction or to do an automatic recall with them, or can do a recall with them where you've maybe written a check to them once before. Okay, so my first vendor you're going to see here is actually set up with a recurring transaction. So the first vendor I'm going to choose is Summit Utility Company. Okay, now Summit Utility Company, I'm going to go ahead and put in an amount for their transaction, $234. And as I hit tab, it's going to search for whether or not there is a recurring transaction. And when it finds that default recurring transaction, it's going to put it in the description box over here on the right. Now notice that there is an E button here where I could edit any of the details of the transaction. Okay, so I can go ahead and click the E button. And the E button would allow me to go ahead and come in here and edit the invoice number or maybe the notation. Remember, it is using a recurring transaction, so it is going to be bringing back any of those details from the recurring transaction as well. So my recurring transaction was originally set up with an account distribution here, so it's bringing that back. I didn't have a notation on it, so the notation is blank, and I didn't have an invoice number on it, so the invoice number is blank as well. If I don't need to make any of those changes, I could just click Save. So if there were no changes that I needed to make, I didn't need to enter in any of those details, I was done with this before I ever hit the E button. Okay, now each line is a separate transaction, so this next line could be a different transaction. Let's say that this next one that I see on my bank statement came out on July 19th, and it was to Summit Water Company. Well, Summit Water Company, I don't have a recurring transaction set up for. I actually have, though, written checks to Summit Water Company before. So let's say that I'm going ahead and I'm entering in this transaction, and my bill for Summit Water Company is $435.56. And I go ahead and choose Summit Water Company. Well, it's going to tell me over here that it's recalling an entry from a previous transaction. So if I hit the E button, we'll see that it's bringing back details like which account, and then of course which distribution that was set to in that previous transaction that it recalled. But unlike the recall when you're on a regular transaction screen, the recall on a regular transaction screen generally will recall the dollar amount from that prior transaction. With this screen, it's using the dollar amount that I entered in over here. So it's not replacing that with the dollar amount from the recalled transaction. Okay, so that's how a recall would work. Okay, but let's say that I have a vendor, and let's say there was a transaction on 7/24 of 2019 on my bank statement there that was for a brand new vendor that I hadn't had a previous transaction for. And that vendor is Protect Now Insurance Company. So we're going to go ahead and enter in Protect Now Insurance Company here. And I don't have a previous transaction for them. The bill is a total of $567.98. And when I select it, you see that it can't do a recurring transaction and it can't do an automatic recall. Now, I'm not going to be able to save this transaction until that button is green. When I click Post, it would give me an error. So I've got to go in and fill in the details by clicking on the Edit button. And there I'm going to have to select the accounts. Well, this particular bill happens to be split between my insurance for my building, which is $345, okay? And then the remaining portion is for our liability insurance. And we're gonna go ahead and choose insurance liability there, okay? And then it fills that in. Okay, now before I save this transaction, if I'm planning on using this again on the quick transaction screen, then it could either use the recall feature or the recurring feature. The problem with the recall feature is that it's not going to know to split it between these two lines. So it's going to put the total amount on the first line. So everything would be posted against insurance building, unless I came to this screen and edit it and split it between the two. If I set it up as a recurring, if these amounts are constant and the next time I enter in this bill, it's going to be the same amounts, I'm going to go ahead and set it up as a recurring. I'll call this my insurance bill. And the first line is going to be a fixed amount, and that amount is $345. And this next line could either be a fixed amount and be the $228.98, or I could say it's 100% of what's left over, which of course would be the $228.98. So I can go ahead and save that and set it as the default for Protect Now, so that the next time that I use this on this quick transaction screen, it would be set up as a recurring transaction. When you're done with all of the transactions that you wanted to be part of this group, you're going to go ahead and click the Post button. If any of those transactions was marked over here on the detail to print it, this one has not been marked, but if it was marked to print it, remember that's usually determined by the default on your sequence. If any were marked to print, then it would also print them when I hit the Post button. If they're not marked to print, such as my transactions, then it'll just go ahead and post these. And it's going to go ahead and post these each with their individual dates. We'll see that here in just a second. So I'm going to go ahead and click Post on this. and it goes ahead and it posts all of the transactions. And I'm just going to quickly bring up a transaction search here so that you can see each one of those transactions posted with their own unique date. So here's the first one for Summit Water Company. Here's the next one for Summit. I'm sorry, the first one was for Summit Utility. The next one was for Summit Water, and then of course for Protect Now Insurance Company. Okay, so each one posted with its each individual date. And that is the quick transaction feature of CenterPoint. Thank you for attending this training video.